Thank you so much for having me. It's a blessing to be with you and to share some of this research that I've been working on for a long time. The narrative of Abraham's test by God in Genesis 22 is known by Christians as the sacrifice or the near sacrifice of Isaac. In Jewish circles, it is called the Aqedah Yitzhak, the binding of Isaac, or sometimes more simply just the Aqedah. But if you are an Ashkenazi Jew, you would say the Aqedah. There's different pronunciations. And that means the binding, from the verb akad, to bind, found in verse 9. Now, for a long time, I wasn't troubled very much by this story. Like most Christians and Jews, and like many academic theologians and biblical scholars, I simply accepted Abraham's response to God as a model of faithful obedience. But I've come to wonder whether Abraham's response to God should be viewed as laudable. Certainly, the weight of tradition is against anyone who questions Abraham as a model of faith or obedience in Genesis 22. Yet I think the question must be asked whether the tradition of prior interpretations of the Aqedah, each interpretation dependent on a particular historical context and the assumptions and interests of the interpreters, should that act as a straitjacket, preventing new and fresh readings of the text? Well, I believe they shouldn't. So I'm going to attempt to unbind the Aqedah from the limitations of traditional readings. My motivation is that a fresh encounter with this ancient text from a new angle, raising new considerations, might not only illuminate its meaning, but renew our experience of God, the God whom Jews and Christians believe may be encountered precisely through this text. In recent times, more and more theologians and biblical scholars, both Jewish and Christian, have admitted a sense of unease with what seems to be Abraham's blind obedience to God, an obedience that includes being willing to kill his very own son. Those who let their uneasiness guide their interpretation of Genesis 22 have often believed that they were reading against the grain of the text, exercising a hermeneutic of suspicion, protesting what they assume the text clearly teaches, namely, Abraham is a positive model of faithfulness to God. But I'm going to account for my skepticism about Abraham's response in Genesis 22 on internal, inner biblical grounds. I want to do exegesis, not ideological criticism. Or to use Jewish terminology, I'm proposing a Peshat reading of the text, not a Midrashic reading. This paper is part of a larger project, a book I've just completed called Abraham's Silence, which examines the Aqedah in light of biblical models of vigorous prayer, including the lament psalms, the intercessory prayers of Moses and the prophets, and the protests of Job. The argument of the book is that the God of the Bible clearly desires vigorous dialogue partners, people who will talk back, even challenge God, which means they're testing and learning the extent of God's mercy. So the question is why Abraham does not do this in Genesis 22, since this is precisely what he had done 4 chapters earlier in Genesis 18 when he interceded for Sodom. The book has 3 chapters on Abraham, but I'm only going to present the core of my argument today, and a pretty compressed core at that, for why I think Abraham did not pass the test. This is going to require an alternative proposal of what is being tested, which means we've got to turn to a contextual reading of the Aqedah in light of the broader Abraham story. One common way to read the Abraham story is to follow the narrative arc of promise, delay, and fulfillment, especially the promise of Abraham's descendants, through whom his line would continue, by whom the nations would bless themselves or bless each other. This narrative arc moves from various articulations of the promise, through Sarai's barrenness, to the attempt to produce an heir through Hagar, God's specification that the heir will come through Sarah, followed by prediction that it would happen shortly, and finally, the birth of Isaac. This narrative arc reaches its culmination in Genesis 21, prior to the Aqedah. So the question for me is, why do we need the story of Genesis 22? What exactly is the function of the Aqedah in the larger Abraham story? The traditional interpretation is Abraham is being tested for his willingness to give up the child of promise, the very one through whom the blessing would come. It's a test, in other words, of Abraham's wholehearted commitment to God, placing this commitment above every earthly value, even God's promise of an heir. And at this point, we can compare the 2 parallel leave takings to which Abraham is called, linked by the repetition of Lech Lecha, possibly rendered as go yourself, so-called ethical dative. In Genesis 12:1, Abraham is called to leave his home and family. In Genesis 22:2, he's called to sacrifice his son as a burnt offering. In one case, he has to make a break with his past. In the second case, he's called to relinquish his future. And this reading connecting these two texts has been going on a long time. It goes back to rabbinic times, and many commentaries point this out. So this idea that Abraham is being tested for his wholehearted commitment to God has prima facie plausibility. When Israel was tested in the wilderness in Exodus and Numbers, this was to prove their trust in God. And prove has here the sense of bringing out and realizing a potential. Prove it in practice. The potential must have been there, but it might have been latent. So the stringent conditions of testing can force the one being tested to rise to the occasion and show their mettle, so to speak. So is Abraham being tested to see if he's willing to give up his son and his future out of commitment to God? The first problem with this interpretation is ethical. The commitment to God that Abraham has to demonstrate involves being willing to kill his very own son. How can this be a model for commitment to God? It works as a model only if we abstract from the very particularity of the text to some general axiom about the fact that we need to be wholeheartedly obedient to God, an axiom that's clear from elsewhere in Scripture and did not need to be grounded in Genesis 22. But there's a second problem with the Aqedah, the traditional reading of it anyway. It is unclear why this test is needed at all, because the Abraham story, when read carefully, gives no evidence of Abraham's special attachment to Isaac, such that giving him up would prove any commitment to God. Abraham, it would seem, is rather committed to Ishmael, something that's very clear from chapters 17 and 21. When God tells Abraham that Isaac, not Ishmael, is the one through whom the covenant will be passed, this leads Abraham to plead for God not to forget Ishmael. He exclaims, "Oh, that Ishmael might live in your sight." And when Sarah wants him to send Hagar and Ishmael away, we are told the matter was very distressing to Abraham on account of his son. But Abraham expresses no such distress about Isaac in Genesis 22. In fact, the account of what happens in Genesis 20 suggests that Abraham is so attached to Ishmael, he simply doesn't care about the replacement son that God promised. Abraham had passed off Sarah as his sister in Egypt back in chapter 12, with the result that the Pharaoh took her into his harem. He does that again in chapter 20, this time with the king of Gerar, who takes Sarah into his harem. But this comes after God announced that the covenant heir would be born through Sarah. And after God had predicted this would happen shortly, perhaps within the next year. Yet knowing this, Abraham goes ahead and passes Sarah off as his sister a second time, not caring that he might lose her and the promised heir with her. Indeed, she might even have been pregnant at the time. Given that it isn't clear at all that Abraham is attached to Isaac, could it be that Abraham is given a chance here to prove his love for Isaac? After all, God's instructions to Abraham contains the following description of Isaac. Your son, your only one, whom you love, Isaac. So maybe Abraham's love for Isaac was being tested, or at least that's part of the test. Now, Abraham's love for Isaac is not actually stated as a fact by the narrator, as is typically assumed by commentators, but occurs in what is effectively a parenthetical description of Isaac in God's instructions to Abraham. We could take the phrase, whom you love, asher ahavta in Hebrew, to have the rhetorical force not of a declarative statement of fact, but rather of suggesting to Abraham that he loves Isaac, or attempting to evoke his love for Isaac with a sense of, you love him, don't you? So prove it by your response to the test. Could it be that Abraham's actions are meant to reveal whether or not he loves Isaac? But what would be evidence of that love? I suggest that Abraham could prove his love for Isaac by speaking out and protesting God's command to sacrifice him. Speaking out on behalf of Isaac might well extend and deepen Abraham's incipient love for his son, because testing often brings to the surface and makes explicit what is only potential. So it's very significant that when the phrase, your son, your only son, is repeated later in the story by the angel of Yahweh, we do not find a repetition of whom you love. These verses affirm Abraham's fear of God and obedience to the divine word, in that you have not withheld your son, your only one, from me, but notice, Given that Abraham has just attempted to sacrifice Isaac, it makes sense that this God-fearing obedience would not qualify as love for him. So that phrase is omitted. So I think we need to rethink what God means when he says through the angel, now I know that you fear God, that you are a God-fearer, literally, that you've essentially not withheld your son, your only son, from me. This statement clearly describes what was discovered through the testing, but it is a logical fallacy to infer this was the purpose of the test, especially if we have reason to believe otherwise. A professor may say to a student after a test, now I know that you're a C student, but that doesn't mean that was the purpose of the test. The professor was hoping the student would put some effort into it and get an A. With this in mind, I'm going to suggest that Abraham was not being tested for his unquestioning obedience. That's not something God wants, but rather for his discernment of God's character. I agree he was being tested for his trust in God, but genuine trust is not equivalent to blind faith to do anything a voice from heaven tells you. Rather, trust in God requires knowledge or discernment of what sort of God this is. So I'm going to note here that besides the narrative arc of the promise of descendants, which culminates with the birth of Isaac in Genesis 21, there's another narrative arc discernible in the Abraham story, and that is the arc of Abraham's growing relationship with God. This is a very important narrative arc, since the Abraham story is about the genesis of a new relationship formalized in a covenant in chapters 15 and 17 between a God whom later scripture will distinguish radically from the deities of the nations, and a man with no explicit prior knowledge of this God. So let's attend to Abraham's developing relationship to God in Genesis. Taking as our cue the various divine speeches addressed to Abraham between Genesis 12 and 22, because God never speaks again after Genesis 22, let's note the ups and downs of Abraham's verbal responses on each occasion. These responses exhibit a growing and then declining degree of intimacy and confidence in the divine-human relationship. God speaks to Abraham on two occasions in Genesis 12 and once in Genesis 13, but the first time any verbal response from Abraham is recorded is in Genesis 15. In Genesis 15, God speaks lots of times, initially about the promise of an heir, then about the promise of land, and Abraham responds with questions in both cases, honestly expressing his doubts. And in both cases, God takes his questions seriously and responds appropriately to bolster his faith. God speaks again in Genesis 17, extensively about the covenant and circumcision, but also about the birth of Isaac through Sarah. In all this, Abraham speaks only once, asking God not to forget about Ishmael, and God says, I won't, but he reiterates the promise about Isaac. And beginning in Genesis 18, when three men visit Abraham and Sarah, there is some speech recorded from God. He is distinguished as one of the three men, and he speaks about Sarah's giving birth. No speech of Abraham is reported back to God, but Sarah speaks once in reply to deny that she laughed, to which God responds, oh yes, you did laugh. Then comes the extended dialogue between God and Abraham in Genesis 18. God reveals his intentions about Sodom and Abraham to Abraham, which this generates Abraham's bold upbraiding of God about doing what's right, followed by God's agreement to spare the city for the sake of 50 innocent. Then Abraham speaks 5 more times, brings the number down, and each time God agrees. Finally, in Genesis 22, God, Ha Elohim, not Yahweh, which is a deviation from all the previous speech introductions. God addresses Abraham twice at the beginning of the narrative, and twice more through an angel from heaven, where he is identified as Yahweh at the end. In all this, Abraham says only one word, Hineni, which means here I am, on 2 occasions. Now, what is the nature of this God whom Abraham is coming to know? In all of the reported dialogues between Yahweh and Abraham, Yahweh is shown to be a God who listens to his servant and tries to address his articulated needs, and in the case of the rescue of Lot from Sodom, even his unarticulated needs, because God rescues Lot no matter what. So one way to think about this relational narrative arc is that it has to do with Abraham coming to understand the nature and character of the God who called him out of Haran. And a sign of Abraham's growing or diminishing discernment of God's character is his willingness to speak up in a manner of the later psalmists and prophets, articulating his own needs and interceding on behalf of others, which exhibits a trust, a fundamental trust in the reliability of God. This now makes sense of the intentional opportunity God gives Abraham in Genesis 18 to learn more about the divine mercy through the process of intercession, in order that he might teach his children and his household the way of the Lord. Here it's worth pausing to understand what's going on in Genesis 18, because I believe that this episode is crucial to interpreting what happens in Genesis 22. After the two angels depart for Sodom, Yahweh remains with Abraham, for he has something he wants to tell him. And Yahweh muses to himself, shall I hide from Abraham what I'm about to do, that is concerning the cry of Sodom that's come to him? And Yahweh decides to inform Abraham of this cry in order that he may charge his children and his household after him to keep the way of Yahweh by doing righteousness and justice. Tzedakah mishpat. When God tells Abraham that he's going down to see if the cry he has heard from Sodom demands justice and judgment, he waits on Abraham's response. But Abraham overinterprets God's statement that he's going to examine the situation in Sodom, and Abraham thinks God has already decided to destroy Sodom, the city where his nephew Lot is living. That's partly due, I guess, to the reputation of Sodom, which is alluded to in chapters 13 and 14 as quite negative. But it's also possibly due to Abraham's assumptions about the character of God and what constitutes divine righteousness and justice. But notice, this is precisely what God wants to teach Abraham by revealing his intentions about Sodom. The only reason the Sodom narrative is in Genesis is because it's a teaching moment for Abraham. God wants Abraham to be able to instruct his children and his household in the way of the Lord so they will do righteousness and justice. This means that Abraham himself first has to be instructed in God's righteous ways. Abraham does indeed intercede vigorously on Sodom's behalf. He upbraids God for unjustly planning to destroy the righteous or the innocent with the wicked, and he encourages God to do what is right and just, and challenges God, despite being, as he puts it, just dust and ashes. In a series of requests that God save the city, initially for the sake of 50 righteous, which he eventually ratchets down to 10 as his last offer, Abraham tests the extent of God's mercy, and God accepts every request. Contrary to a traditional reading of the text, there is no bargaining or bartering or haggling going on here. Don't believe any of the commentaries that say that. Because bargaining involves two people starting at opposite ends and meeting in the middle. The dialogue in Genesis 18 is different. Abraham makes an opening offer of 50. God says, sure. And Abraham says, how about 45? God says, okay, fine. Abraham proposes 40. God agrees. Then Abraham drops the price, if you will, by 10 instead of 5 and offers 30. God said, let's do it, man. Then Abraham says, how about 20? God says, yep, that's fine. Then Abraham says, I have one final offer. Notice Abraham says this is final offer. How about 10? God says, 10 it is, brother. Question is, what's God trying to teach Abraham about the way of Yahweh from this exchange? If this was a used car sale, I think the seller wants to give me the car for as little as I will pay for it, even free. What sort of righteousness and justice is God displaying here? Certainly one infused with mercy. And a number of scholars have searched for that phrase, tzedakah mishpat, in the Hebrew scriptures, and point out that it always refers to mercy. It also does that in ancient Near Eastern context, the cognate terms, when they're joined together. It's as if Yahweh is looking for an excuse to save Sodom and Lot. Jeremiah 5 suggests that God might forestall the destruction of a wicked city for just one righteous person. That Abraham stops at 10 suggests he has not fully plumbed the depths of divine mercy. He has not yet learned what God wanted to teach him. Nevertheless, God rescues Lot and his family through the agency of the angels, even though Abraham had not thought to ask for that outright. Maybe he just didn't think God was that merciful. He was pushing it a little too far with God. He had to back off. So at the end of the dialogue in Genesis 18, Abraham has not yet quite learned what God wanted to teach him, even though Lot and his family have been saved. So I'm going to frame the question that wins its way through the Abraham story as follows. How will Abraham be able to distinguish this God he's coming to know from the gods of the nations? This sort of discernment will be necessary so Abraham will be equipped to charge his children and his household after him to keep the way of the Lord by doing righteousness and justice. In light of the specific command Abraham receives in Genesis 22 to sacrifice his son, I'm going to put the question of Abraham's discernment of God's character a little bit more pointedly. Is the God of Abraham simply like one of the pagan deities of Mesopotamia or Canaan, who requires child sacrifice as a symbol of allegiance? Or is this God different, a God of mercy and love for his children, who is willing to forego judgment even on Sodom for the sake of the innocent? That was something Abraham should have learned in chapter 18, so he could pass it on to his own children, but he didn't learn it. The lesson was cut short by Abraham himself. And so in a final climactic episode in the Abraham story, God gives Abraham another chance, another opportunity to learn and grow in the relationship. But God ups the ante this time. God raises the stakes. It's not his nephew Lot who will be destroyed, along with Sodom, his home. It's Abraham's own son, Isaac. And it's not God who will do it. Abraham must do it by his own hand. If anything would force Abraham to speak out, to appeal to the mercy of God, this would be it. He's got the opportunity in this test to protest the command, to intercede for his son's life, which would articulate his view of the character and ways of God, both in what he says and by the fact that he says it. And it would further show his love for Isaac, which would be a good thing and not in contradiction to his commitment to God. But Abraham doesn't speak out. He's silent. Whereas Abraham became silent at the end of his intercession in Genesis 18, he stopped the conversation earlier than he needed to, so he never fully grasped the wideness of God's mercy. Here in Genesis 22, he never gets the conversation off the ground. He is simply silent. And this silence speaks volumes. It articulates a view of God as clearly as if he had used words. So I suggest that Abraham's silence speaks of God as a harsh taskmaster who is not to be challenged. And if that's what Abraham learned about God, we may wonder what he passed on to Isaac. Many commentators through the ages have noted that Isaac is missing at the end of the Aqedah story. In verse 5, Abraham tells his servants, his young men, Nacharim, that he and the boy will go up to the mountain to worship and we'll return to you. We will return to you. Yet the narrator tells us in verse 19 that Abraham returned to his young men, his servants. Isaac is conspicuously absent. This leads to rabbinic interpretation that he was taken, believe it or not, to the paradise, the Garden of Eden, to recover from his wounds that Abraham inflicted on him. Okay, Abraham's son is not recorded as returning with him down the mountain. And this is a very well-crafted narrative in which every detail matters. Indeed, in the remainder of the Abraham story, Abraham and Isaac live in different places. Isaac in Beher Lahai, Abraham in Beersheba, which are both in the Negev, but not quite in the same place. What about Sarah? She's missing at the start of Genesis 22. Everybody wonders, why doesn't Abraham tell Sarah, I'm going to go and sacrifice my son? And she'd say, what, are you crazy? So he doesn't tell her, right? But she's also missing for the rest of Abraham's life after Genesis 22. The next time Sarah is mentioned, we are told of her death in Hebron, where she had been living. Abraham travels, presumably from Beersheba, where he was living, to Hebron to bury her, but it doesn't look like they were living together. In fact, he's living in Beersheba, where Hagar is living. Very interesting. So if we attend to the geographical references in Genesis, it suggests that Abraham's attempt to sacrifice Isaac resulted in Sarah's alienation, as well as Isaac's traumatizing. The fact that Abraham comes down the mountain alone and is never reported as seeing Isaac again prods me to ask if Abraham's attempt to sacrifice his son without even attempting to stand up for the boy and plead to God for his life, as he pled on behalf of Sodom, might not have had the effect of traumatizing Isaac and alienating him from his father. Would you come down the mountain with your father who just tried to sacrifice you to his deity? What was it like for Isaac as his father trusses him up like a sheep for slaughter and picks up the knife? The Hebrew for knife is ma'achelet, not an ordinary knife. This is a butcher cleaver, at least in later Hebrew. And as the boy lies there watching while Abraham stretched out his hand to take the knife to slaughter his son, he is stopped by an insistent voice from heaven. Abraham, Abraham! The name is repeated, as if the angel is desperate to stop him. And Isaac's life is spared. Not so far as he knows because of his father. He had tried to kill him, or by an angel who forbade him to do that. So if God wants Abraham to instruct his children and his household in God's way of righteousness and justice, I think we need to ask this question. What did Isaac learn from the episode on the mountain in Genesis 22? I can safely say that if Isaac learned anything of the mercy of God, it was through the angel's intervention to stay his father's hand. But if he learned it was God who commanded his father to sacrifice him in the first place, the sense of mercy would not be pure and unvarnished. I think minimally Isaac would be a bit confused about the nature of God. And if Abraham's response to God's command did affect Isaac negatively, how could we view Abraham's response as exemplary? Wouldn't there be an alternative way to be faithful to God without traumatizing and alienating your son? There's a whole lot of stuff I could deal with about the effects of the Mount Moriah episode on Abraham's family. I'm going to focus on just a couple of really key ones. One of the most pronounced effects of this episode is the structure of the book of Genesis itself. We're familiar with the promises given to the three ancestors of Israel, right? Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. This triad is found over and over and over again in Scripture. But the book of Genesis, after the primeval history, consists of the Abraham story, the Jacob story, and the Joseph story, each introduced by a reference to the father of the main character. The introductions to the stories of Abraham, Jacob, and Joseph all begin with, "These are the Toldot," the generations of, followed by the name of the patriarch's father, Terah for Abraham, Isaac for Jacob, Jacob for Joseph. There is no heading, "These are the Toldot of Abraham," which would introduce a narrative block about Isaac. Isaac has only one chapter that could even be considered his story, Genesis 26, where God blesses his every effort to dig wells, so he has water, wealth, and peaceful relationship with the Philistines, as if God is trying to comfort him with overabundant grace for what he went through on the mountain. But apart from that single chapter, Isaac is only a bit player in either Abraham's story or Jacob's story. Even in the Jacob story, there's no mention of Isaac between the account of the blessing of Jacob and the account of Isaac's death. And that's a stretch from chapter 28 to 35. Between those episodes, Isaac disappears from view. He has no significant actions that advance the narrative of promise. He is a much diminished, shadowy, and insubstantial character in Genesis. Perhaps that's to be expected, given what he went through on the mountain. One of the most intriguing bits of information we're given that bears on the question of what Isaac learned from the events of Genesis 22 is found in chapter 31, in Jacob's conversation with his uncle Laban, which leads to a covenant between them. Jacob first affirms that despite Laban's underhandedness, the God of his fathers has protected him. And who is the God of his fathers? He is, in Jacob's word, the God of Abraham and the fair, Pachad, of Isaac. And then when he and Laban swear an covenant oath, we are told Jacob swore by the fair, Pachad, of his father Isaac. That is what Isaac passed down to Jacob by intent or otherwise about the character of God. He is the fear. And a contextual reading of the Aqedah suggests that this use of the term fear does not have a positive connotation. That God was to be feared was Abraham's legacy of his son. So what I've tried to show so far is that a careful reading of the Aqedah in the context of the earlier Abraham story, along with the later fallout of the Mount Moriah episode on the family of Abraham, leads us to a reinterpretation of what was being tested and whether Abraham's response was optimal. However, the obvious objection is going to be that this reinterpretation seems to fly in the face of the two angel speeches in Genesis 22, verses 11 and 12, and then 15 to 18. These angel speeches are traditionally read as positively valuing Abraham's response. Doesn't the angel of the Lord speaking on God's behalf validate Abraham's unquestioning obedience? And a surface reading may suggest this, but once we start questioning Abraham's response to God, it becomes possible to read the two angel speeches quite differently. I already began to do this with regard to the first speech. I noted that the statement, "Now I know you're a God-fearer since you haven't withheld your son," signifies what was discovered in the test, but does not necessarily reveal what God intended to be tested. Maybe God was testing his love, not his fear. Likewise, the omission of "whom you love" from the description of Abraham's relation to his son could be read as containing an implicit negative critique of Abraham's response, suggesting it was not optional. Couldn't Abraham have been faithful to God? while also exhibiting love for his son. Since the phrase "whom you love" is omitted also from the description of Isaac in the second angel's speech in verse 16, perhaps we now could start to read other aspects of that second speech as less than fully approving. For example, we might want to reconsider the significance of God swearing by himself. "By myself I've sworn," says Yahweh, to fulfill the promises stated in verses 17 and 18 that he had actually previously made to Abraham. This oath, which is unusual in the book of Genesis, seems to be predicated on Abraham's actions in some way. It's a point stated in verse 16 and in verse 18, which I've emphasized in the quote here. The specific reason given for this oath is that Abraham did not withhold his son, which explains the point of the opening general statement. Because you have done this thing is giving up the son as a sacrifice. I'm going to come back to the angel's concluding statement because you listen to my voice in just a moment. But look at the first statement there. The typical interpretation of biblical scholars is that the promises of blessing, which had originally in Genesis 12 been given to Abraham unconditionally as pure grace, are now tied in some way to Abraham's actions in the Aqedah. The basis for the blessing has changed, and from here it is dependent not only on God's will, but also on Abraham's obedience. Now, in my book, in my analysis, I especially examine the views of John Levinson, the Jewish scholar, and Walter Mobley, the Christian scholar, who've both written a lot on the Aqedah. And they both agree with this interpretation. Levinson is so bold as to say that as a result of Abraham's actions, quote, "the Aqedah has now become the basis of the Abrahamic covenant," unquote. Or put differently, quote, "the Abrahamic covenant has now become a consequence of the Aqedah," unquote. Pretty radical statement. Both Mobley and Levinson and many other scholars agree on two fundamental points. First, they take Abraham's obedience as positive, so that linking the blessing to his actions, making the blessing a consequence of his actions, suggests that God approves of Abraham's actions. But secondly, they understand the linking the blessing to Abraham's actions to be something new and unprecedented in the narrative of Genesis. Both are wrong. I'm going to challenge both. Let's start with the second point, the idea that this is something new and unprecedented. The second point is that the conditional element of the promises began in Genesis 22, but they did not. A conditional element was already articulated in Genesis 18, where Yahweh desired Abraham to teach his children and household the way of the Lord, of righteousness and justice, for the purpose that they may bring about the fulfillment of God's promises. God says, "I've chosen Abraham, that he may charge his children and household after him to keep the way of the Lord, so that the Lord may bring about for Abraham what he has promised him." And what are these promises? Well, they're specified in the previous verse. That Abraham will become a great and mighty nation, that all the nations of the earth will be blessed in him. This means that even before the Aqedah, Genesis 22, Abraham was given a responsibility to embody and communicate Yahweh's normative standards of righteousness and justice. Derech Yahweh. It means further that prior to the Aqedah, God intended that Abraham's embodiment and communication of this way would affect in some way the reality of the blessing that God intended for the nations. It was precisely so Abraham would learn Yahweh's way, then model and communicate it, that God revealed his plans about Sodom to Abraham. That was a teaching moment. But Abraham didn't learn what God intended. He neither learned it in Genesis 22 either, not until God called off the sacrifice. This leads me to wonder, wouldn't it make more sense that Yahweh needs to uphold the promises by his own oath, precisely because they cannot be sustained by Abraham's less than faithful response in the Aqedah? The oath, in other words, is not a sign of approval of Abraham's actions. It's meant to compensate for the deficiency of his actions. So while I agree with Mobley and Levinson and many other scholars that there is a change in the relationship between God's promises and Abraham's actions in Genesis 22, I think the change is in the exact opposite direction. I think it's from conditional in Genesis 18 to unconditional promises in Genesis 22. This change is parallel to a shift that we find in the aftermath of the golden calf episode. The motive clause for the second commandment, why you shouldn't have idols, is that God will certainly punish evil, and that God's steadfast love, or chesed, was for those who love me and keep my commandments, for those who are faithful to the covenant, who are obedient. But then comes the idolatry of the golden calf, massive idolatry, and the covenant is broken. And God is going to dispense with Israel. And this requires Moses to intercede on Israel's behalf. He stands in the breach, as many later texts put it, from Psalm 106 to the book of Ezekiel and other texts. He convinces God not to give up on Israel despite their sin. Then, after Israel's failure, God grants Moses a special revelation of the meaning of the divine name Yahweh. In this new revelation, God first of all reverses the order of punishment and love. Love now precedes judgment. And then words for love are multiplied. God is compassionate, gracious, slow to anger, abounding in chesed ve'emet. And then God states that his love would continue despite Israel's idolatry. No requirement of reciprocal love or covenant obedience is mentioned here. This love is now linked explicitly to forgiveness. The difference between the golden calf episode and the Abraham story is that in Genesis 22, God's compensation for the deficiency in the covenant partner is not the result of anyone standing in the breach, as Moses did. Rather, God in Genesis 22 stepped into the breach himself. That's analogous to Isaiah 59, verse 16, where Yahweh says, I saw there was no one, and I was appalled that no one was there to intervene. So his own arm brought him victory, and his righteousness upheld him. God rolled up his sleeves and said, by myself I've sworn, I'm going to do this, because Abraham can't do this. My suggestion, therefore, is that the oath in Genesis 22:16 signifies God's pledge or commitment that his divine purposes will not be thwarted by Abraham's lack. It is furthermore a sign of grace toward Abraham, personally reassuring him that the promises will come to fruition because God is faithful, even when we are not. Okay, so far I've been unpacking the possible meaning of the basis for this oath stated in verse 16, generally because you've done this thing, specifically because you've not withheld your son. But the angel's speech concludes with another general statement, because you've listened to my voice. And it might be thought that this concluding statement is equivalent to because you've done this thing, but I don't think it is. It's more likely it should be taken separately and applied specifically to the final statement in verse 18 about the blessing of the nations. And this is not simply because it follows that promise of blessing, it's also suggested because there is a change from the way the promise of blessing to the nations was expressed before Genesis 22 and how it's stated here. Prior to the Aqedah, in both Genesis 12 and 18, the promise was stated in terms of the nations blessing one another by Abraham. But here, for the first time, the blessing is connected to Abraham's offspring or descendants. By your offspring shall all the nations of the earth bless themselves. Well, just logically, this means that for this promise to be fulfilled, Abraham would need to have offspring. He would need to have obeyed the angel's command to stop the sacrifice of Isaac. So the angel links the promise of sparing Isaac, links the promise of blessing the nations by Abraham's offspring with the sparing of Isaac, because you listened to my voice. I'm not the first one to suggest this. Various rabbinic traditions have suggested this also. Simply put, if Abraham had not desisted from the sacrifice when the angel called from heaven, there would be no offspring by which the angels could bless themselves. So I don't think that you have to read either of the two angel speeches as validating Abraham as exemplary. We do that because that's the lens through which we've traditionally read it. That's the tradition, which maybe is a bit of a straitjacket. But once you start to read a text through a different framework, a different paradigm, you see different things in it. But there's one other really interesting consideration that bears on the question of whether Abraham's response to God was exemplary. Was he really planning to sacrifice Isaac? Or did he really expect God to provide a substitute? I noticed previously that he said to his servants that he and the boy would worship on the mountain and then return. One meaning of worship, some rabbinic commentators suggest, is that he planned to intercede, to pray on behalf of his son, asking God to call off the sacrifice, because the term worship could include prayer. But there's no evidence Abraham did this. After Abraham and Isaac lead the servants, Isaac asks about the missing sacrificial animal, to which Abraham responds that God will provide the sheep. According to the end of verse 6, the two of them walked together. And the same statement ends verse 8. But in between, as they walk, there is a touching, tender conversation between father and son. It's a poignant moment, and it's worth lingering over. My father, says Isaac. Hineni, my son, says Abraham. Same response he will make when God called him in verse 1, and the angel will speak in verse 11. It just means, I'm ready. Here I am, ready to act. Having got Abraham's attention, Isaac then notes that they have the fire, which is the fire stone or the fire pot, which Abraham is carrying, and the wood, which Isaac is carrying. He omits mention of the knife, which the narrator says was in Abraham's hand. But then Isaac asks, somewhat tentatively, I imagine, where is the sheep for the burnt offering? And Abraham's answer to this question is often taken to express his faith. It's actually ambiguous. God himself will see to the sheep for a burnt offering, my son. Does Abraham's answer mean that he had faith that God would provide a sheep so he wouldn't have to go through with the command to sacrifice Isaac? Was he uncertain, hoping against hope that an animal would be provided? Or was he trying to deceive Isaac so the intended victim wouldn't bolt? A lot of rabbinic commentary suggests that one. But there's an even more intriguing possibility in Abraham's answer to Isaac. If my son, in God will see to the sheep for burnt offering, my son was clearly meant to be vocative, that is a direct address to Isaac, it might have better come at the beginning of the sentence. And some translations say, my son, God will provide the lamb. But that rearrangement obscures the ambiguity of the Hebrew. In its present position at the end of the sentence, my son could be evocative of address, but it also could be in opposition to the sheep for the burnt offering. In other words, my son is the animal that will be offered. Earlier in Genesis 22, verse 2, God linked a series of descriptions of Isaac in opposition. Your son, your only one, whom you love, Isaac. If we apply this idea to verse 8, it would effectively identify my son as equivalent to the sheep for the sacrifice. And again, many rabbinic commentaries suggest that that's what Abraham intended. There is a cartoon making its way around the internet that depicts the ambiguity in verse 8, though not specifically about this Hebrew text. In the cartoon, which I got permission to put in my book, Abraham asked his father, where is the sacrifice? Isaac asked his father, where is the sacrifice? Abraham says, well, God will provide, Isaac. Isaac then queries, wait, what did you say? God will provide Isaac, or God will provide Isaac? Abraham says, come here, son. To which Isaac responds, I ain't budging till you put in a comma. This is an excellent example of the sort of ambiguity found in Abraham's answer in verse 8. It's an analogy to that ambiguity. So given the syntax of the sentence, we have two possible meanings. We are left to wonder whether this ambiguity is intentional. It might be a signal from the narrator about the complexity of Abraham's response. It might communicate what we call a Freudian slip on Abraham's part. But of course, we don't know what Abraham was thinking. We only have his verbal response. At least at this point, that's all we have. But when we look further on in the story, there are some significant clues as to whether Abraham believed God would provide a substitute. If he did believe this, one sign of such belief would have been his search when he got to the mountain for a substitute animal. But there is no reference to Abraham even looking to see if such an animal was provided. Instead, having built the altar and placed the wood on it, he immediately proceeds to bind Isaac and place him on the altar, and then reaches out his hand, takes the knife, and prepares to slaughter his son. And he's so intent on the sacrifice, the angel has to call his name twice, Abraham, Abraham, to make sure he gets his attention. It is only after the angel instructs him not to go through with the sacrifice, don't stretch out your hand to the young man or do anything to him, that Abraham lifted his eyes and saw the ram that God had indeed provided. As if only then did it dawn on him that there might actually be a substitute for the sacrifice. The details about the narrator provides about the location and circumstances of the ram are very significant. When Abraham looks, he sees a ram behind, caught in a thicket by its horns. My question is, how long was that ram there for? Let's understand what's going on. A ram is a male goat or sheep, and for its curled horns, from which a shofar is made, to be long enough to be caught in a thicket, it has to be a fully grown specimen. A large adult ram full of testosterone would have made a huge racket trying to extricate its horns from the thicket that it was caught in. The fact that Abraham did not hear the ram and thus didn't look around for the source of the noise when he arrived at Mount Moriah suggests the ram had probably stopped struggling. In other words, it had been caught in the bushes provided by God as a substitute long before Abram arrived and exhausted itself. Such prior provision of a substitute would have flowed from the mercy of God towards Abraham and Isaac. But if the ram had been there, provided or seen to by God, as Abraham claimed, Abraham clearly missed it. Did he even look to see if there was a substitute? And suppose the ram had only been there a short time, when it's still struggling to get free, making noise. That means Abraham was so hyper-focused on the sacrifice of his own son, he shut out the noise of the struggle. In either case, Abraham did not even bother to investigate whether God had provided a substitute. This leads me to think he did not believe his own words to Isaac, that God provided a sheep as a substitute. I'm finding it more and more difficult to think well of Abraham in this story. Despite my critical reading of Abraham, I propose not to judge him too harshly. I don't think he passed the test of discerning God's character with flying colors, but he did not just turn away from God in disobedience. He genuinely tried in the end to obey the God he understood, inadequate as that understanding was. If I were to construct a hierarchy of possible responses that Abraham might have made back when God initially said, "Take your son and sacrifice him," I would put protest and intercession on behalf of Isaac at the top of the list. For me, that's the optimal response. It fits the pattern of Scripture. Through such protest or intercession, Abraham would have demonstrated a profound discernment of God's character, that God was merciful and compassionate. Or his intuition that God was merciful and compassionate might have led him to prayer, and this intuition would have been confirmed by his prayer, resulting, I believe, in God rescinding the request. And then he would have demonstrated to Abraham how much God's love was for him, and Abraham would have demonstrated his love for Isaac, maybe strengthening the tenuous bond between him and his son. A little below that optimal response would be Abraham's genuine belief that God would provide a substitute. So he might have remained silent, which is not quite optimal in my opinion, but he might have trusted that somewhere along the journey or on the mountain itself, he might find an animal to sacrifice. But when he arrived, he did not give even a cursory glance around to see. He simply bound his son, put him on the altar, and didn't look around till after the angel called off the sacrifice. That leads to the title of this presentation. I am inclined to think that Abraham did not pass the test in Genesis 22. His silent obedience indicated he did not discern God's merciful character until the angel called off the sacrifice, and he did not show love for his son by interceding on his behalf. There's a whole lot more that we could say about the Aqedah narrative, but for that, you're going to have to get my book. It's my claim that Abraham could have chosen the more excellent way of protest concerning God's command and intercession for his son. This would have had the salutary result of Abraham exhibiting and growing in his discernment of God's mercy, and it would have demonstrated and maybe deepened his love for his only remaining son. How might Isaac have turned out if he had witnessed his father pleading on his behalf with God's positive response to Abraham's intercession? Would he have returned from the mountain with Abraham? Would he have bequeathed to Jacob a different notion of God than the fair? And would there be a unit of narrative material, perhaps coming between Ishmael's genealogy and the Joseph story, focused on Isaac's life, beginning with, "Now these are the toldot of Abraham"? Given the way things turned out, we can only imagine. Thank you.